Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Armstrong Robinson with AALU Gamma, and I couldn't be happier to be joined today by my friend, Josh Holmes, one of the elite political consultants and chief communications mavens to operate in American politics in the last several decades. His most famous title has been Chief of Staff to Majority Leader Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, but he's consulted and his opinion is sought after by many, including those of us at AALU Gamma, about his political insights. And we're tremendously fortunate to be joined with Josh to give us a bit of a perspective on what's happening in American politics and beyond the roller coaster, what's going to happen this fall and how that will impact your business and your clients. Josh, welcome.
Thank you very much, Army. I'm going to take you on the road. That was quite an introduction.
Well, you know, I got to earn the money you're paying me somehow. Ladies and gentlemen, this will be a 60-minute webinar. We will try to get to some questions using that Q&A box on your screen. Josh and I are going to have a bit of conversation about what's happening in America. You know, you got, as part of the registration of this webinar, Josh wrote a very insightful piece in the Wall Street Journal opinion about the potential of a coming political earthquake as a result of the economic and healthcare effects of the pandemic. You know, Josh, let's start there. Big picture. That was published May 28th. It's been almost a month. So a lot has changed, right? It's Ferris Bueller. Life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you're likely to miss it. So tell us how your thinking has evolved, what's the same, what's different, and what do you see things now looking into July?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I wrote that piece. It appeared, I wrote it about a week before it appeared, and it appeared in the Wall Street Journal the same day that the George Floyd protests erupted in Minneapolis. And we can get into sort of the correlations behind all of that as we move along. But I think a lot of the underlying themes that were discussed in the piece have basically been demonstrated throughout the country and continues to be demonstrated throughout the country here over the last few weeks. But let me just start with the reason why I started the piece in the first place. I had reviewed, for my clients, both political and corporate, I'd review a lot of polling, and I had reviewed 3 months worth of polling from the beginning of March until the end of May, basically. And I was just absolutely struck by the lack of any real movement whatsoever in any of the top line polls. And what I mean by that is the president's approval rating, the president's image, the candidates down ballot, like Senate candidates, their head-to-head ballots, their images, everything. Nothing appeared to have moved. And I thought to myself, that's just impossible. I can't, because the backdrop of that was 35 million people losing their jobs over the course of 8 weeks. You had a complete disruption for the first time in American history of commerce. You were quarantined in homes. There was a disruption of American life, the likes of which we've never actually seen in this country, and somehow nobody's opinion changed. And I found that just like completely impossible. And so I delved into it and looked at all the various crosstabs. And the conclusion that I came to was there was an awful lot of America that really wasn't grappling with reality yet at that point. They had, because of the CARES Act and honestly the responsible action by Congress and the president to try to get money into small businesses and indirectly into the hands of the people who are most affected by the crisis, people's economic situation hadn't fundamentally changed. And actually those who are most vulnerable, people who had definitely lost their jobs and may not have been coming back and were in that sort of middle to lower class tier where you couldn't afford to miss a paycheck, those people were actually in a better economic place in May than they were in February. And so that the anxiety that you typically see with job loss and everything else just hadn't quite set hold. In addition to that, and I'm sure all of you see this in your own communities and in your own professional lives with your clients and whatnot, there is a huge segment of America that is entirely insulated from this because their jobs allow people to do what we're doing here today with a Zoom call. They can telecommute. They can get done almost everything they can through Zoom calls, conference calls, and what have you. There's a huge consulting component to it. There's a massive amount of people employed in the tech communities where they actually were becoming much more significant in this time, and they were adding a bunch of jobs and increasing revenue. And so it further split the difference between people who were operating in a new economy and people who are operating the service industry. And the problem was nobody was basically expressing what was tantamount to just almost Great Depression like concern that was facing this country. And so my theory of the case was, once that becomes evident to people, we're going to have a cultural explosion in this country, because it's not just about their paycheck, which it's a huge part of that. There's also huge cultural disconnects between urban, suburban, and rural America that are underscored by the economic problems that we were having. The conclusion that I drew, that we'll see if it comes true or not, but the conclusion that I drew is, once this all becomes evident, this November's election is going to become amongst the most divisive cultural, economic, and ideological elections we've ever had in this country. And it basically has nothing to do with the candidates. It has everything to do, I mean, that helps. Don't get me wrong. That is a big part of it. But in this case, the environment itself has lent itself to an election that could be incredibly explosive.
Well, and I think, that's a really important point. The regular listeners will know I talk a lot about the rise of populism in America in the last decade plus, and it's happening almost equally on the right and the left. The expressions of it in Congress are sometimes different, sometimes the same. That it has pointed out the circle that is the political and ideological spectrum. And if you study history, which I know many of our listeners are, what has typically cured or reset from populism, one of the things is pandemic disease. The problem is, as Josh points out, this pandemic has not yet, it may never, create a shared common experience in America. Your geography, your economic status, your socioeconomic level, and very much your race drastically impact how badly this is affecting you. And that's, so we don't have a shared experience. If you work, as Josh says, at a computer and you can do phone and Zoom, and it may have been disruptive, it is no doubt disruptive to your life to convert to this. There's at least the possibility of converting. For lots of people, there isn't. And the other part of it that quarantine does, there's been lots of literature and sociological study about the rise of social media and how it allows for each of us to create a curated information stream in our own lives. And when we're out in the world and interacting in offices and restaurants, we interact, at least at some level, with people who have different opinions. But when we sit at home by ourselves, constricted to our families, and our entire experience outside of that is in a screen, whether it be television or the internet, it's calcifying that experience. And so, I talk to chiefs of staff and members of Congress in like a state like Pennsylvania. And if you're in the Philadelphia urban area, your experience is one thing, probably a little more akin to New York and New Jersey. And if you're in, the big T of Alabama that separates the two major metropolitan areas, you haven't had much experience with this disease, but your economics has been fundamentally cut off. And that creates a bit of anger that we're seeing in different places now.
Yeah, no question about it, Army. And I should say, what we've seen over the last 2 weeks, I left that piece basically in the place where the political bubble is going to pop. You never know what triggers that. In this case, I would argue that George Floyd and some extremely significant necessary reforms and introspective looks on how we deal with policing, particularly minority communities, was that trigger. And ultimately, protests became riots, became more unrest, and honestly won't go away. I mean, and I don't mean that go away because the problem hasn't gone away. Clearly, the problem hasn't gone away, and there needs to be significant reform. But I think the longevity of the the uprising has, in addition to very real racial inequities and problems that we need to face in this country, in addition to that, what you're seeing is the results of a lot of pent-up anxiety about the economic situation that people find themselves in. And when you don't have a job to get fired from, you have a tendency to go out and make decisions that you wouldn't ordinarily make. And I think there's an awful lot of, we're seeing extreme ideological positions on both sides. You're seeing the rise of, you watch cable TV, you could become inordinately depressed about the state of our country. Trust me, that is not where everybody is. But the acute anxiety, the acute problems, and the anger has a little piece of that is a back end result of what we've been up to for the last 3 months with quarantining and COVID. And I think that's going to continue, honestly, throughout the summer.
So Josh, let me, undergirding, as you talked about how you came to your conclusion, you talked about your being a voracious consumer of polling data. And our friend and colleague in politics, Amy Walter, who's a senior editor at the Cook Political Report, likes to say that listening to most reporters talk about polling is like listening to teenagers talk about sex. They know all the words and they really have no idea how it works. I think it's appropriate just to take a minute and talk about like national polling versus state polling. What are not for you, who obviously gets into crosstabs, and for those of you who don't know what crosstabs are, when you get into the deck of polling, which is hundreds of pages long, you can look at subsets of demographic or geographic information and how they answered the questions differently. That's what a crosstab is. But as folks look at this, because I think your conclusion was that numbers hadn't moved, and I think if you consume the popular national media and you hear the discussion of the president's polling and his ballot test against Vice President Biden, it seems like that's a little bit disconnected from what I think people are hearing. So maybe talk about that, and what are the three things you recommend people ask or look at when they see polling data and want to understand what it means?
Yeah. So there's something, just what I call narrative polling, right? And most major media companies do this. CNN is probably amongst the most egregious in terms of polling to take whatever out of that poll that fits the narrative, right? There could be, I'm not saying their polling is completely wrong. I'm saying whatever numbers that they end up highlighting for their audience are the numbers that fit the narrative. And their narrative, of course, is, like a Trump nosedive or something like that. For many, many months, that was just absolutely not true. And on the 28th, when my piece posted, what I used as a benchmark is the Gallup polling. And Gallup is, has been around for 40 years. It's sort of been a gold standard in terms of presidential polling. And I didn't get it. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of national polling numbers. I just don't think they make a whole lot of difference. But for the purposes of this argument, I felt like it made most sense to try to highlight on a macro level. And what I used was this Gallup poll in February that had the president's approval rating at 48, approved, 49 disapprove. And fast forward 3 months and 40 million jobs, it was 48 approved, 49 disapprove. Now, over the last 3 weeks, that has gone down 10 points. And a 10-point loss in a Gallup approval rating of a president who is as ubiquitous as this one, there is no mysteries to Donald Trump. Everybody has formed an opinion one way or another. That is a significant move. That is a race-altering change. Doesn't mean it can't come back, but for the time being, what I was talking about with that political bubble, it popped. It definitely popped, which means folks who had been favorably inclined towards this president because of economic policies, because of a belief that they thought this president was probably better suited than Joe Biden or anybody else on the Democratic side to pull us back out of an economic recession. Maybe there was some cultural pieces to it. A significant portion of those folks began to move away. That's a big deal because during the course of this presidency, his numbers have been ironclad. There's not really a whole lot of change from the day he took the oath of office until May. But now we've seen our first real rescission of that support. Now, that's a national. It matters what state you're in, right? Army, you're an expert at this as well as I am. If you live in Ohio, you got a very different perspective than living in California, right? And for the purposes of this discussion, California doesn't matter. New York doesn't matter, right? Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, North Carolina, Florida, they matter. And those opinions, there has been in certain states a decline, not as precipitous as the decline that you see nationally.
Well, just to unpack that, I mean, I think everybody knows by now that New York and California don't matter because they're considered already in Joe Biden's column. And they're in Joe Biden's column by such huge margins, they're not even contestable. So if the margin goes up, you still only get the net amount of electoral votes, which, I mean, go back to 2016, 100,000 votes out of however many millions cast. I don't remember what the number was, 100,000 votes in 3 states, right? Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And that's why the list Josh offers is really important, because it comes down to where those battleground states are. I mean, where do you look for the state polling, and what do you think, we've gotten a couple of questions around the same theory, given the thesis regarding the divisiveness of the election along socioeconomic, race lines, et cetera, and the fact that President Trump appears to have roughly 40% of the population that's going to vote for him no matter what. How does this affect the presidential, do you think, at this point? And maybe you could talk about some of the state polling you've seen.
Yeah, so one of the most important things to remember about all of this in the Trump era is there's so much information, news and information flowing all the time. A week is a lifetime in American politics today. And somebody said to me, I think this was 2 weeks ago, somebody said the number of days until the election is the same number of days back from when the United States killed General Soleimani in Iraq. And I thought, holy cats. I mean, we've been through a pandemic and a global recession and all of these things, impeachment, all of these things since the killing of General Soleimani. And so if you take the number of days from now until the election and then go backwards that many days, we were in the middle of an impeachment hearing, which, Army, you remember the discussion is, well, they're never going to be able to beat Donald Trump now, right? I mean, this was the strongest that he had been. He was on the edge of acquittal by the Senate. Republicans largely galvanized around his message, and Democrats were still battling through this primary that was getting uglier and uglier by the minute. Nobody might nominate Bernie Sanders. A lot of things changed, right? You come this many days up, and we're in a world that's unrecognizable from that one. I would suggest that there is at least a even odds chance that the world that we find ourselves in November is unrecognizable from the one that we're currently in. So take everything with a grain of salt. But there are some extremely concerning trends, right? The great message that this president had that was able to eat into suburban areas that were otherwise sort of offended by his style was the economic component. This is a bad economy. This is bad. Now, you've got jobs numbers a couple of weeks ago that came out that were much more favorable than people anticipated. You had consumer spending up 17%, which was reported yesterday. If that trend continues, I think that he will have some residual rise out of that, and it is going to be incumbent upon him to try to make the argument that there isn't any other president that was able to sort of stem the bleeding and bring us back as an economy from something that was as unprecedented as a global pandemic. That is, again, that's the argument he's going to have to make. I don't know whether he can make it or not. Democrats obviously will make the obvious other side of that argument, that all of this could have been prevented in the first place. And we'll see where it nets out. My guess is there's probably an awful lot of inputs over the next 130, 40 days in addition to that also help shape this election.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. I think your point is really strong. And when I presented to our board of directors 2 weeks ago, I mean, that was my message, right? There is fundamental uncertainty. The world has changed multiple times over in the last 90 days, and it could change again in the next 90. And what are the economic impacts? What is the international scene? I mean, we are really laser focused domestically right now. I think that's where almost everybody's mindset and conversation is, but there's a big wide world out there, and it is not asleep as we continue to struggle our way through this, right? There's North Korea, there's other pieces that certainly have the ability to change this. I think let's talk, before we get more deep into what the fall may bring, Josh, let's talk a little bit about what we think is going to happen this summer. Our friends, Leader McConnell and Tim Scott, great senator from South Carolina, introduced a policing reform bill this morning that they're going to vote on in the Senate next week. The House Judiciary Committee is doing that. Their own policing bill today. And so I think that's June. And as you noted, there's really critical reform and lots of really important awareness that needs to go on in response to the inequities that we've seen and the protests. So that's undoubtedly a really important piece to this. And I think, the reform is badly needed and overdue. The political analysis to this is a little bit more interesting and complicated about, whether people want solutions or issues. And I think, it's hard to know what's in anyone's heart, or we can't know what's in anyone's heart as to that question. But I think there's a lot of balance, and we'll see whether or not Leader McConnell and Senator Scott can negotiate with Nancy Pelosi and the Congressional Black Caucus in the House and hopefully come with some of those reforms. But that's going to consume now till the July 4th recess. And certainly the conversation needs to go on beyond that. But what do you see coming on the back end of that? And, there's been discussion now for a month and a half about a phase 4 bill. The president and the speaker are talking about infrastructure. Certainly the spending is just eye-popping by any standards. We're going to post a deficit north of $3.7 trillion this year. It's fundamentally stunning. So let's talk a little bit about what's going to come legislatively this summer, and then we'll move back to the political in the fall.
Yeah, that's a great way to set the deck on that. So the police reform will start next week, and as you mentioned, it'll probably go until the July 4 recess. I know, having spoken to Leader McConnell about it, their intent is to get an outcome and to pass a law. They're going to have to obviously negotiate with Senate Democrats to get to a point where they're above the 60 vote threshold necessary to pass something. And there's been some sort of initial sniping back and forth about, whose bill is more adequate or not. They're going to drive towards a solution on this. You may see some kind of like old school legislating, right, where people are offering amendments and passing bills. And I think if that happened, that would be a glorious result, and it would send a really good message to people who are awfully concerned, the vast majority of America, that are awfully concerned about the state of policing and African-American communities. And so I think getting that message, suggesting to people across the country that this isn't just another one of those, lamentable experiences that we all go back to work and shake our heads and say, shoot, why does that happen? But there's actually something being done here. And I think it's important, and they think it's important. I hope it's in the effort to try to make a law and not a point, as you suggested. There's an awful lot of politics in election years, presidential election years, and there's a temptation to try to draw the other party into a situation where they can't possibly meet your ultimate goals, and so you just end up in a political exercise rather than a lawmaking one. I hope that's not going to be the case. But on the back end of that discussion is, as you mentioned, is the next phase of CARES, right? A fourth phase of the COVID relief. And they've been talking about this since the end of April. And they've done some updates to the PPP program, which has taken a little bit of the urgency away, knowing that program has begun to make some corrections to try to make sure that businesses have access to capital and that kind of thing, and what they can pay for. But going forward, what McConnell has said and what Senate Republicans have said is we've got to make sure that we understand how all the money is being spent and where the holes open up in our economy that haven't been plugged. And so we can then come back with another phase and use whatever resources we allocate to fixing what hasn't worked so far. And that's not evident yet. I read something the other day that only about half of the initial CARES funding has gone out the door. And that's, hospital funding and all kinds of relief to states and localities. You know, you remember the debate about whether or not we were getting money to states and local governments, and the answer is yes. It's just it's got to go through a bureaucratic process at that state and local level, which is something people are concerned about as well. You can see, you know, backups and unemployment and that kind of thing, and which is concerning to a whole lot of folks. They want to take that and try to craft a package that is very narrowly targeted at the reopening of the economy and ensuring there's a bridge to get the people who are back to work incentivized and their businesses incentivized to do business. Also providing that safety net, the continued safety net for those who are out of work on a more permanent basis, or at least something that looks like it'd be 6 to 8 months down the line. That's a tricky balance. That is certainly not the approach that the House Democrats took with a $3 trillion package that had, you know, a little bit of everything for folks. I think Senate Republicans feel like $3 trillion is just fiscally irresponsible, and they felt like the $3 trillion that they've already spent, frankly, was necessary, but they were, you know, it gave them some significant heartburn. The administration is interesting in this discussion because I think on one side of the coin, they believe that flooding the zone with a whole bunch of more liquidity into the marketplace has got to be good for the economy, which has got to be good for the president's reelection hopes. And so you've seen some talk most recently over the weekend by Peter Navarro about a $2 trillion bill and some infrastructure packages. I think the most important part of this discussion is there was a conversation 2 weeks ago with Leader McCarthy, Leader McConnell, the president, Steve Mnuchin, where they all sort of wrapped their mind around an opening offer of somewhere south of $1 trillion that had immediate economic impact. So it wouldn't be sort of these long-term infrastructure programs. Now, that's where they were 3 weeks ago. I don't have any reason to believe that has fundamentally changed. Where it does change is once Republicans consolidate around what the pieces of that puzzle look like, they then do have to go to Democrats and negotiate that out. Then that price tag starts to come up. Where it ends, I don't know, but they have said that their timeline for this is more towards the end of July now before the August recess than the end of June before the July recess, as was first suspected.
Well, I think part of that for everybody listening, that is part of what's driving that data is the jobs and retail spending numbers we just got. That combined with the fact, as Josh noted, that a bunch of the money hasn't been spent. Like, we've done a ton of work with all of you around the PPP. There's still like $100 billion in PPP money that could still be applied for up till June 30th. So if you haven't, or your clients haven't, you can still avail yourself of that. But end of July is when the federal unemployment bonus, the extra $600 a week, that's when that runs out. And that's considered one of the driving factors around it. Plus the legislative calendar. August is, going to be political conventions. September will be funding the government in advance of the end of the federal fiscal year. And then October is, of course, a campaign month for everybody involved. I think, one of the things, Josh, that I think is interesting, and I'm curious what your point of view is, there has begun to be discussion amongst Republicans about deficit sensitivity, which I think to many of our members sounds kind of almost ludicrous, given
right.
where we've been and where we're going. Sort of a little too late kind of thing. I don't think. Do you think there will be any pressure to try to pay for or offset that phase 4 bill? And if not, when do you think that becomes part of the discussion again?
Well, if history is our guide on this, there is always a political reaction on the back end of a crisis that deals with the responsibility of the allocation of money. You'll recall the TARP bailouts of 2008, a pretty good example. The political environment that began in 2009 and ultimately ended up being the rise of the Tea Party in 2010 was a perfect example of that. Once you emerge from the acute crisis of an economic recession and begun to put building blocks in place, people ask an awful lot of questions about where all that money went. And at that point, there's always a political reckoning that becomes part of it. In 2010, there was actually some really important deficit reduction things done. Of course, they didn't hold over time because we've got, a lot more irresponsibility than we all care to admit in terms of spending money at the federal level. But, they did things like the Budget Control Act, which was the first real reduction in government spending of any magnitude since the Korean War. I mean, there were significant reforms. Now, of course, subsequent Congresses reversed all of that, and began to refund all of the programs that were defunded. But the point is the conversation for 4 years revolved around debts and deficits. I think leaders on both sides, retired and current, say that was a huge missed opportunity to do something about entitlement reform. Of course, we've got 65% of the federal budget that you don't vote on. The members of Congress don't have anything to do with. It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the interest on our national debt. When I started in government, that was like 35%. It is doubled, and it's going to be.
And you're not that old.
Yeah, I know. I'm feeling a lot older now, but
that wasn't that long ago, Josh.
Yeah, right. I mean, it is climbing each and every year, and the pot of discretionary money, everything that goes for healthcare, education, defense, all of that stuff that you actually vote on is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So at some point, they're going to have to address that. We have not felt the American people have not felt the acute consequence of debt and deficits at this point. And the problem is, once you do feel it, you got a hell of a problem. I mean, think back to like Greece a decade ago, and the cuts to social services across countries, across this world. We can't have that in this country. And so there's going to have to be some proactive thinking. My hope is that post 2020, whether we have a divided government or whatever, people give real thought to how you go about structurally changing what it is that we spend on a federal level. And I think there's going to be the political push to do that. Now, whether they take advantage of it, I don't know. The stuff that we're talking about is all kind of third rail politics, right? As soon as you mention the words Social Security, images of people pushing grandma in a wheelchair off a cliff start to appear on your television. And it's always been a significantly bad politics to try to wade into. But I think, we've seen some generational change in this country over the last few weeks, and there may be an appetite to do that. At least I hope so.
Well, additive compromise is easy. I bring an extra 12 donuts and Josh gets 7 and I get 5. We still have more donuts than we did. If nobody leaves the webinar until someone loses a finger, it's a much more protracted conversation. And that's the human nature element of what Josh is talking about. Last quick point on the summer agenda, Josh. One of the big debating points, and I know Leader McConnell has staked out a pretty firm position around this, is the liability protections as an element. The Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader Schumer have talked about funding for states, and certainly their unemployment is like among their chief negotiating concerns. Talk for a minute about where you think, what is the issue and where you think that the liability protections is going, because I think there's a pretty strong negotiating position around that for the summer.
Yeah, so I mean, McConnell has said that there will be no bill without it, and that's a deep red line. McConnell doesn't do that often. He really is loath to try to draw lines in the sand, particularly on big moving legislative pieces. And so when he says it, he means it, and it will, I think, almost obviously be a part of some kind of package. And the reason for that, I don't have to explain to this audience, but you've seen every community across this country grapple with this, how you go about beginning businesses again, how you go about opening things up, what's safe, what's not. You get extremely conflicting public health advice from the highest levels, really acutely bad advice and stuff that it basically feels like you're on your own. But we also all know that there is no way to drag our country out of this and to get people with money back in their pockets again until we get the economy going. You can't just continue to send checks to people and hope that we're going to have a country by the end of this year that looks anything like the one we had at the beginning of this year. You know, somebody said the other day, and I thought it was a really good point, COVID may not kill us, but what we owe China in the end might. And it's a really important way to look at this. I think that the liability piece is critical to having at least not negligence protected, but good faith efforts to try to protect your employees are not somehow fallen victim to an army of trial lawyers who are currently filing hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits at the state and local level to businesses of all kinds in the hopes that, you know, if somebody contracts COVID and God forbid they have serious health complications, that's a payday. Listen, we're all in this together. If you are making your customers uniquely vulnerable, you know, you've got foam parties going on in your bar or something, like that's not what we're talking about here. That you're still on the hook. You've got a huge liability problem there. But if you are trying to serve takeout to somebody who's coming by to try to feed their family and you're doing everything right with masks and whatnot, that should not be an acute problem. Sorry, I've got to mute my phone here. That should not be an acute problem that you have you know, real liability for. And so I think that's why that's such a huge part of this agenda. And, you know, I think that will be in whatever package ultimately clears.
As a reminder to everybody on the webinar, please do feel free to use the Q&A button. We'll try to get to as many questions. But shifting back to the fall and the politics, let me come with one of our audience questions, Josh. You know, and it is simply stated, you know, the theme of the question is, polling's never been kind to President Trump, and the whole notion and much discussed underreporting of people admitting their fondness or support for him and his policies because of the vitriol and reaction. You know, it's the questioner asked, do the racial tensions and the number of people polling even less likely to admit supporting President Trump than in 2016? Do you think that's a factor in what you're seeing?
No, I think the problems are all pretty obvious at this point. I mean, we've had one election between the presidents and now where we know he suffered an extreme recession of votes from the suburban communities across this country. I think people have been pretty vocal about their distaste for President Trump's style. It was mitigated a bit, like I said, by the economic output that we were in, you know, incredible economy that we had. Now that has become a little bit of an issue. In terms of overall polling, though, Army, you have to focus on the state by state trends over a period of time. One poll is never going to give you a hard look at where you're at. But if you look at a couple of months worth of polling, it should settle out from different sources. It should settle out basically into giving you an idea of where things stand. And I like to go to aggregators, you know, like Real Clear Politics, or, you know, New York Times has got a bunch of really good ones that are always worth taking a look at. But an accumulation of data is much better than, you know, these shock polls that you see on cable where they're like, oh my God, the president's down 17 points nationally. In all honesty, who cares? I mean, it makes no difference. If he doesn't receive a single vote in the state of California, it matters not. But by not receiving a single vote, you know, his national average would go to 35. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. Like I said, we go to our individual states that are acutely important to presidential elections because they swing back and forth. No president of the Republican side has won without Ohio. No Republican on the president's side has won without Florida. Those two are key. Presidents should carry Ohio without a problem. They have held their own in Florida. States like Pennsylvania seem pretty precarious. Michigan seems like it's almost out of reach for this president. Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota now. Minnesota is one that I would put in the same category as those others, despite the fact that it hasn't been Republican presidential candidate hasn't carried it since 72. it's now more competitive than an awful lot of other states. North Carolina is another state that you would put in the middle of that for a whole bunch of reasons. But those are the things to focus on.
Well, and for those of you who don't know, Minnesota is Josh's home state, so he's got a personal interest and a lot of family connections back there. Let's move down.
It's a really, I'll just for a minute, it's a really interesting case study for the country as a whole, because for 40 years, the rural northern part of Minnesota, what they call the Iron Range, was a lockstep Democratic vote. Like they said when Walter Mondale ran for president in 1984, we'll see how many votes that Ronald Reagan gets in the suburban areas, and then you'll figure out how many they need to win up north. It used to be so Democratic you could just set your watch to it. What was very Republican and had been held for a Republican congressman are all those western suburbs of Minneapolis that were held by a guy named Ramstad, a guy named Paulson. They were, they had it for 40 years. All of that shifted. Now you have Republicans holding a seat that Democrats had held for 4 decades, Democrats holding a seat Republicans have held for 4 or 5 decades. The shift that you're seeing nationally has happened in Minnesota. And I think they have the added interesting element of the epicenter of the George Floyd protests. And they're feeling this in a way that, I think every community is, but they're particularly attuned to it. And that dialogue seems to have been brought to a national focus where I think that state is in the national conversation in the presidential.
Very interesting, Josh. Let me transition a bit down ballot and start with sort of an outlier that gets lots of fanciful attention, which is Texas. And that's not usually in the conversation, right? You mentioned Florida and Ohio. Texas is in the battleground, but there was a Q poll out, Quinnipiac University poll out, that showed a really troublesome picture for both the president and Senator Cornyn. Perhaps we'll start there, and then we'll go to what are hopefully the actual battlegrounds. But I know I got some questions from the membership around that from Texas, and so I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so as long as I've been in politics, now 20 some odd years, it's always been the year Texas turns blue, right? I mean,
and Georgia.
They're like, this is the year, demographic changes. This is Democrats are gonna, and then like up until a couple of years ago, Republicans say the same thing about New Jersey, right? It's like, this is the year. New Jersey is definitely going to be a Republican state. I'll believe it when I see it with Texas. Now, clearly, there are some tighter margins in both Georgia and Texas than Republicans have been used to, but the fundamentals are still largely with Republicans here. Remember, your demographics are a little bit different in Texas than they are in other places throughout this country. Your Northeastern liberals will look at Texas and say, wow, look at the number of registered Hispanics. Gosh, we got a lot of Democratic votes. No, that's not the way it works in Texas. The cross dem, there's just as many Republicans in Hispanic Republicans in Texas as there is anything else. I mean, the demos just don't work. That's why every time that you get the Northeast or the New York and DC punditry looking at their demographics and saying Texas is so competitive, that's where they get it wrong right away, is because they do the math of, where certain demographics of people are supposed to land based on what they're seeing in other states. That's not the way it works there. Now, I will say there is huge suburban epicenters in Texas, right? Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Austin. I mean, there are massive population centers that this president has had trouble with nationally. Are they a little bit more conservative than the national bent? Yes. It does not mean that he doesn't have a problem with that. We saw that in 2018 when the number of seats flipped. He does have significant problems there. I think Senator Cornyn's in a little different situation. His brand is a lot more Texas-centric. I don't see him having any problem, honestly, Army. I wouldn't be surprised to see him win by, double digits. In 2018 was the historic high for Democratic turnout in a midterm, an election. Ted Cruz was facing Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke raised 5 times more money than Ted Cruz did, blanketed the airwaves, became the darling of the national media, and promptly got crushed, right? So Look, I think Texas is probably not it. There are some other states that are interesting, but I think
Well,
Texas is pretty safe at this point.
yeah, like I said, I wanted to address it for our Texas membership because I know they had questions. The, so the battleground for the Senate control is 4 seats, right? That's the margin by which Leader McConnell holds his majority today. Let's walk through it. You get 2 pickup opportunities, Alabama and Michigan. We talk about a little bit about that, and I'm interested in your thoughts about John James and Michigan against Gary Peters, given that you think maybe the presidential is moving out of reach. And then we've got, kind of an expanding list. I mean, the top are Maine with our great friend Susan Collins, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, Cory Gardner in Colorado, and Martha McSally in Arizona. That's the biggest bubble. And then, next tier is Iowa, Montana, and the double barrel in Georgia. So walk us through where you think things are today.
Yeah, so we'll start with the 2, democratically held seats that Republicans are gunning for with Alabama and Michigan. Alabama is one of those, as you all recall, the Roy Moore disaster of 2017. Republicans feel like short of nominating an alleged pedophile, Alabama should be in good shape, right? I mean, this is a seat that is as red as it gets, reliably Republican and almost more Trump than Republican. So this is something that I think in the end, Tommy Tuberville is likely to be the nominee, former Auburn football coach. I think he's likely to win and beat Doug Jones. Jeff Sessions is running there too, former senator, former attorney general. But I think Tuberville at this point has the edge. I would put that in the Republican column, and so you tick up 1. Now, all of the liabilities, we'll cover Michigan first. Great candidate in John James, had a lot of success in running against Debbie Stabenow last cycle, and where people didn't really think that he had much of a chance, and he ran a heck of a race. And so people have given that a lot of oxygen. I think the problem that he finds himself in is a very, very tough cycle in Michigan to be running. If that is ultimately competitive on a presidential level, so will John James. But it's hard to see him able to swim upstream 5-6% as he would have to do today in order to win that. Other seats. So Arizona is one where Martha McSally, appointed senator, she ran last time against Kristen Sinema in a very difficult election and lost. She's been under fire since moment 1. Gabby Gifford's husband, former astronaut, Kelly, has been an incredibly good candidate in terms of raising money, has just a ton of money, led on the target, has maintained a lead at some point. And we'll have to see where that race goes. But my sense is that's one of the most difficult ones on the map for Republicans. Colorado is where everyone in the world said, well, this is where Democrats are just, it's not even on the in the same way that Republicans look at Alabama, Democrats have looked at Colorado. Well, just when you begin to think through that, John Hickenlooper, former governor, ran for president, who decided to get into the Senate race, has come under unbelievable fire for ethics violations and a whole bunch of really bad information flow. And, I've looked at polling as of last week. That race is not over by any stretch of the imagination. That's one to keep on the radar. Democrats should win that. That should never be an issue, but they haven't won it yet. So anybody who says like Colorado's in the Democrat, I don't know about
Cory
that.
Gardner is an extraordinary senator and a very talented politician. So if anybody can hold it, he's certainly the guy to do it.
That's right. And then the others, the blue state, the other blue state that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016, where there's a Republican senator up, is Susan Collins in Maine. Interesting thing about Susan Collins, she looked like she was in huge trouble at the beginning of this year when we were going through the impeachment exercise. The rest of the Republican senators looked like they were in pretty good shape during that particular time. She was having massive problems. The ballot question went from like +10 to +6 to +2 to behind in some polls. Since COVID, she's recovered and she's come back up. And for people who followed Maine politics, she has a unique relationship with that electorate. This is an electorate that reelected her in 2008 amongst a financial crisis that swept every other Republican incumbent in a tough seat out of office by margins. And in that environment, she beat a sitting congressman from the most populous part of the state by 20 points. She does uniquely well when the questions are less ideological and more about who's delivering for Maine. This has been an interesting environment for her. She's been able to recover her political. There's a great column in National Journal that Josh Kraushaar wrote on this week that sort of explores some of that with Susan Collins. Then you get into a whole bunch of states that they went for Trump in 2016, and they're kind of precariously perched at this point. North Carolina, Iowa, Republicans have 2 seats in Georgia that they're defending. These are all seats where if the president wins re-election, you wouldn't worry about it. If the president got into significant problems in those states, again, very difficult to see how Republican senators swim upstream more than 5 points or so within their own states. Right now, that's a really open question as to whether or not there's big problems there. Because if the election were today, I think there would be big problems. But again, as we talked at the outset, things change a lot in the course of a couple of months. And I think the chance for them to sort of stabilize and recover and make a final push is obviously there. So those are kind of the states that I'm watching, Army. There's a race in Kansas, an open Pat Roberts seat that has been bedeviling Republicans from the very beginning. You remember they wanted to have Secretary of State Mike Pompeo run for it. He declined. Their whole concern was a former gubernatorial candidate, Chris Kobach, who lost last election cycle, who they think is uniquely bad candidate and the kind of candidate who could lose a Republican seat in a general election in Kansas, which seems sort of improbable, but he's the kind of candidate who could do it. They're feeling more comfortable now. I think Roger Marshall, a sitting congressman, is somebody who has filled the void there a little bit, and Republicans are feeling a little bit more confident in their ability to take that, keep that seat. But again, there's a lot of stuff out there, and with an environment as dynamic as this one, I don't think there's any seat on the board that you don't have to take a look at and say, okay, what happens here if everything goes south for both parties? So it's fascinating.
You know, like him or not, like his policies or not, but it's a great lesson of the 2016 election in the United States, right? The voters matter, and they vote predominantly in the fall. That hasn't begun yet. One of the interesting things, and then we'll sort of turn to the House and round out, but you know, there's lots more movement to vote by mail and the COVID impact on voting in person. Georgia had a really bad experience in their primary a couple days ago. You know, the voters matter a ton in this, as you well know, and that's why, you know, when you see a pundit on TV or talking, unless they've been there talking to people, in addition to their quant analysis of polling data, like you gotta look a little questioning if they haven't been to Texas in 6 years or more, telling you what Texas voters are going to do, because it matters. And as the earlier questioner pointed out, like, you know, the voters, our system has lots of flaws. We got lots of reform we need to do, but it's still Winston Churchill, right? What he said about the American democracy is it's the worst system of government. It's just better than all the others. And so, you know, that this will have an impact. But talk about like the mechanics of voting and the vote by mail and how that extends the process. Like, it's not all November 3rd, right? That means you're voting over you know, weeks, and sometimes in some states, you know, Washington and others that have been doing vote by ballot for a while, vote for a month and a half. Right. So how does that look to you in the fall?
It's such a good question because it does change everything. Secretaries of state across the country have had to grapple with how they get ballots in with their current infrastructure. And there's a national debate about this that is less about that and more about, there's been an ideological struggle for decades about whether you federalize elections. Democrats want to federalize elections. Republicans want to keep power at the state and local level. That's sort of a side. Anytime you hear anybody in Congress talking about what they need to do with elections, it's largely irrelevant to the point that you're driving at. The point that you're driving at is, how are states administering an election when their systems are not built to handle a very different way of voting? You've seen, like you mentioned with Georgia, Wisconsin is another one, had really difficult lines of communication that people didn't understand, resulted in long lines, inefficiency voting. And then there are other places who have been sort of doing elements of this for a long time. Arizona and Colorado, actually 2 states that are sort of in the crosshairs this time around, are states that have voted by mail. 2/3 of the ballots are cast far before election day. This is no problem for them. This is basically business as usual. So different states have different ways of setting these things up. The whole point going into November is to ensure that voters understand how they vote, right? Because you can once you have a ballot in your hands and you can vote, problem's over. It's the confusion on when you have to request it. Is this an absentee process? Are you mailing it out proactively? I mean, unless you're like literally sitting on the Secretary of State's webpage hitting refresh, you don't know. And that's part of the problem. So they've got to do a really good job of communicating leading into this fall's election about how people get those ballots. Kentucky is one, for example, that has an inordinate amount of same day voting, right? Election day voting. They don't have anything other than absentees in terms of casting a ballot. It's so different that you can't request the people in every state. They publish the number of ballots that have been requested just as a matter of transparency in government. Kentucky doesn't even have that, right? Because they don't do it. I mean, it's absentees, military, and voting on election day. So they've had to rework everything in the last few weeks to make sure that people are requesting ballots and they're sending ballots out. We'll see next Tuesday how that works, but that's another big test. The point you made about not being able to understand completely who won on election day has always been a little bit of a problem. We saw that in 2018 in Florida, for example. It's always Florida, right? But I think we've got that again in a number of states because of this process. And there's going to be counting when you're mailing in ballots for a number of weeks and you only have to be postmarked by election day. You know, it takes 4 or 5 days to get that at the voting center and your precinct. And so, you know, some of these tight races, you could see whether you go to almost Thanksgiving before you get election certified, which of course in an election like this is not helpful to try to calm national discourse, but I think it's probably reality.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We've got only a few minutes left, Josh. So let me just do a quick rapid fire. We haven't touched much on the House. You're more of a Senate expert. I'm a House guy. The margin of Speaker Pelosi's majority today is 17. Cook Political Report, one of the foremost prognosticators, rates the field at 85 competitive races. 3 of those are already in the Dem column, so the margin's really 20 in the House. What's your current thought about the House landscape, and is there any hope in your mind that the Republicans flip it?
I think there's always hope when you don't know ultimately what the environment will look like. But I will say it's going to be very, very difficult for Republicans, in large part because the districts that they lost, the majority making districts that they have, a 10-year House Republican majority was built upon, are those same suburban districts that have been a huge problem for President Trump. In the House, you know, we talked about whether a Senate candidate can outswim the top of the ticket by 5 points statewide, and that's, you know, sometimes possible. Remember, each one of these races, you're talking about 60 million, 70 million, maybe even $100+ million spent in their own right that's disconnected from the presidential. House, we're talking like $2, $3, $4 million. These are races that the national environment has a huge impact upon. I find it almost impossible, except for extremely unique personalities, that you could be completely disconnected from the top of the ticket. I think the president is going to continue to have trouble in a lot of these suburban demographics, which doesn't look good in terms of recapturing those seats that you mentioned, Harmy. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but then I think they actually have a better chance in a midterm than they do in a presidential at recapturing a majority with this particular way that the seats are lined up. They've also lost, remember, there's 4 or 5 seats that were basically redistricted out on them that were reliably Republican seats that were in the last 2 years just completely changed, and they're not even on the map anymore. And so you got to really have an inside straight to get a House Republican majority at this point.
Yeah, there are, I mean, just to countenance my friends in the House Republican political arm, there are still enough seats that were won by President Trump in 2016, currently held by Democrats, that that's part of their theory of the case. But I agree, it's going to be really difficult. 2 last quick questions, and then we'll wrap. Presidential debates. We got a question about this. Like, Currently, Joe Biden is,
In his
you
basement.
know, hanging out in his basement, trying to do Zooms, doing the same thing we're all doing, trying to figure
Yeah.
out how to operate in a digital world in which you can't do the traditional campaigning. The president is trying to restart his rallies with the first one on Saturday. Um, do the debates matter? Like, what's that going to be like, you think, and what impact do you think it's going to have?
They totally matter. They always do. They're always the American people's one opportunity to cut through the tailor-made advertising and the, customized public appearances to just see what your two candidates look like on stage. I think there's more so even with President Trump because there's such sort of intrigue about what it is that he's going to do. You're not going to get a boring political debate no matter what. There's added intrigue to the point because of COVID. Vice President Biden has been in his home and he hasn't been out. I mean, I saw yesterday the last time that he held a press conference of any kind was April 4th. I mean, in ordinary circumstances, I don't think the press would allow it, for a major party presidential candidate not to field questions for 3 months. But from a Democratic point of view, this is exactly what you want to do. I mean, if the longer that you can ride this, the better, because the story's not about Joe Biden, it's about Donald Trump. Each day that the story is about Donald Trump and not about Joe Biden as an alternative is a day that Democrats win. And I think they've won an awful lot of days lately. That is going to become harder and harder to do as we go along. I think there will be a straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of public appearances and having to get out there and play a more aggressive role. We're not going to do a McKinley 1900 election again where, you can basically sit in your front porch and, a reporter will stroll by every once in a while and he'll shout a question at you and you'll, smoke your pipe. That like, you can't do that in America in 2020. And so there will be some discourse, and how the vice president handles that is going to be really important. But the debates, as you mentioned, Army, this is really high stakes poker. I'm not sure exactly, how to game that out. I think that the Trump people feel like they have an advantage. If you talk to the Biden people, they feel very strong about their ability to counter what they see as erratic messaging and somebody who actually knows the nuts and bolts of government and can kind of like speak practicality to it. How it nets out, I don't know. And the two of them clearly don't like each other either. So it's going to be fun to watch no matter what.
Well, it sort of allows us to end where we began, right? It's a very divisive point of view in what you believe. There aren't many people who haven't formed their opinions around this. The intensity is changing, but where the undecided and the independents in the key states that Josh mentioned will determine how this goes. And there's a lot of the campaign and a lot of the American experience to be dealt with in the next 130, 140 days before we get there. And all the moments can matter. Can I get you to venture any predictions about where we are? As I said to the board when we met, ultimately all this is important and interesting, and it will play itself out. But there are really only 4 potential outcomes, right? You have a status quo election in which Donald Trump is reelected. The majority in the Senate is held by the Republicans, and the majority in the House is held by the Democrats. You could get a situation maybe where Joe Biden is elected president and the Republicans still hold the Senate. You still get a bit of divided government. Your final 2 options are a clean Democratic sweep and a almost unfathomable, but still possible, clean Republican sweep. Anything you want to offer about where you think the likelihood is as to how that shakes out?
Yeah, I mean, look, modern history again. I mean, the only thing you can do is go back to how elections have sorted out. But it's been pretty rare back since to 1996, I believe, where there is any real serious split ticket voting when it comes to national presidential elections. And so I think the idea that, if the president is beaten by Joe Biden, I think the likelihood of Democrats picking up the Senate is pretty high. But they have a ways to go, as we've covered. I mean, these seats are not totally in jeopardy. So I think there is still a scenario where Republicans can hold the Senate. I think it's very difficult to pick up the House, as I've articulated. The key with the presidential, in my view, is this economic argument. And as we said, if the president he's not going to be judged based upon where the economy was that he took in January of 2016 and where it is in November of 2020. What he'll be judged upon is whether or not he was able to turn around the 35 million unemployed, the complete economic collapse of this country, and put it back into working order where you have reasonable growth and growth projections, where people feel like, okay, we're stabilizing here. This is not a free fall. That is the argument that wins or loses this election, because the voters that make a difference, that have the ability to go either way, that's what they're looking at, right? Everybody who's focused on social issues, everybody who's focused on, you know, the unique talking points from the Republican side and the Democrats, everybody's already made up their mind. There is a unique voter out there who's going to have to ask themselves whether or not they want to roll the dice with the economy that they find themselves in November, that Joe Biden and Democratic supermajorities basically are they going to be able to pull you in the right direction or wrong direction? There will be a vicious argument for the next 3 months, 4 months about who's right or wrong on that. But I think that's the question that ultimately settles it.
Josh, thank you very much for your time and insights today. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll hear from Josh again in the fall. And then preview, we will hear from him right after the election. He'll help us interpret what happened and what's going to come next. So please do become a promotional member today. Remember, our new website for everybody is unifytheprofession.org. Please encourage your friends to join, and stay tuned for future updates. We're going to keep coming at you. We got PPP updates coming later this week and next, based on regulations that the SBA and Treasury have put out. But thank you very much and have a great day. Stay healthy, everybody. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Army.